Welcome to Dark Domain, where the line between reality and nightmare is a little blurrier than you'd like it to be. Tonight we've got 3 stories guaranteed to make you question what's lurking in your reflections. But hey, don't take my word for it. Stick around and see for yourself. Before we dive into the darkness, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any of the creepy content we've got coming your way. And since we're already in a spooky mood, drop a comment below and tell me, what's the creepiest thing you've ever seen in real life? I might just feature your story in a future video. Now, let's get into it. Just be careful. What you see might stay with you a lot longer than you'd like. Reflections of the unseen. It was a warm evening when I first noticed something wrong with my reflection. I had just come home from a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, my eyes aching from lack of sleep. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would wake me up just enough to collapse into bed. But when I looked into the mirror, my reflection didn't quite match what I was feeling. It was subtle at first. My reflection blinked, but I hadn't. A split-second delay. My stomach nodded, but I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I blinked again, so did my reflection, perfectly in sync this time. I leaned in closer to the mirror, staring deep into my own eyes. That's when I noticed it. The pupil in my right eye had a strange distortion, a subtle, misshapen quality that wasn't there before. It looked like a tiny, fractured star, dark tendrils spidering out from the center. My breath hitched. I blinked once more. My reflection blinked back, but this time I saw it clearly. The pupil shifted, a slight ripple in the glass, almost as if something were moving behind it. Something alive. I took a step back. My reflection remained still for a moment longer than I did, as though reluctant to follow me. I rubbed my eyes hard, convinced that I was hallucinating from the lack of sleep. When I looked back, my reflection stood as it should, mirroring every movement, every shift of breath. Still, the discomfort lingered. The next day at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept catching my reflection in the glass of doors, windows, polished floors, and every time there was something slightly wrong. A flicker in my eyes, a delay in my movements. By the time my shift ended, the feeling had worsened. The sense of being watched was no longer something I could ignore. As I walked past a reflective glass door to leave the hospital, I froze. There, just for a split second, I saw my reflection, but the eyes didn't belong to me. They were larger, almost too large for my face, the pupils as black as voids with no light, no life behind them. And then, they blinked. I staggered back, my pulse racing. When I looked again, my reflection was normal, staring back at me with my tired, bloodshot eyes. But I couldn't shake the image of those black eyes, so impossibly dark that they seemed to absorb the light around them. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I rushed home, avoiding every reflective surface I could. I didn't check the bathroom mirror. I didn't even glance at the hallway window. By the time I reached my apartment, I was on edge, the feeling of being watched now constant, heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But when I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my eyelids seemed to ripple and shift, like something was moving in it, watching. Days passed and things only got worse. Every time I looked in a reflective surface, whether it was a mirror, a window, or even the screen of my phone, I saw them. The eyes. They weren't always there, but they appeared often enough to drive me into a slow panic. Sometimes the reflection would hold them for a moment too long, and it wasn't just the eyes. My reflection started moving when I wasn't. I would stand perfectly still, and I would see my arm twitch in the glass, or my head would tilt slightly even though I hadn't moved. It was subtle, maddeningly subtle, but it was happening. I knew it was. One night, in an act of sheer desperation, I covered every reflective surface in my apartment. I draped sheets over the mirrors, taped paper over the windows, even turned my phone off. The sense of relief was immediate, like I had cut myself off from something I couldn't fully comprehend. That night, I finally slept. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up in a strange room. At least I thought I was awake. The walls were lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, stretching out in all directions. I was in the center of it all, standing on cold stone, surrounded by endless reflections of myself. Only, the reflections weren't exact copies. They were distorted, wrong. In the mirror closest to me, I was smiling, but my real mouth wasn't moving. In another mirror, my eyes were shut, while I stood there wide-eyed in horror. Every reflection was different. Some were subtle, just a blink or a twitch. Others were grotesque, warped versions of me with too many teeth, or eyes that were nothing more than gaping, dark holes. I turned in circles trying to find a way out, but the mirrors reflected nothing but the endless versions of me, versions that shouldn't exist. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I caught a glimpse of something in one of the farthest mirrors. A figure, tall and thin, draped in a tattered dark robe that seemed to merge with the shadows of the room. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, eyes that watched from behind the glass. I backed away, but the mirrors stretched on and on, the figure appearing in more reflections as I moved. It was everywhere, in every mirror, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that seemed to vibrate through the glass itself.
You see what they hide. You are the chosen one.
I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out a hand, or something resembling a hand. Its fingers were long, impossibly thin, and they pressed against the inside of the mirror closest to me. The glass rippled, bending like liquid under its touch. The eyes, they watch you now. The voice hissed again, louder this time, like nails scraping across metal.
They want what is yours.
I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, the air thick and oppressive. I tried to turn away, but no matter where I looked, the figure was there, reflected in every surface, every version of me. And then, in the mirror directly in front of me, my reflection blinked. I hadn't blinked. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden, but I could feel it now. Its presence pressing down on me, the weight of its gaze suffocating. My reflection moved again, reaching up to touch its face, its fingers brushing over its eyes, pulling at the skin. I couldn't stop it.
They want your sight.
And then, I felt it. The pressure behind my eyes, the horrible, wrenching sensation, as if something was trying to pry them out from the inside. My reflection dug its fingers deeper into its own eyes, the skin tearing, blood running down its cheeks as it smiled that same horrible smile.
They want to see through you.
I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the mirrors. My reflection laughed, a silent, grotesque laugh, its face now nothing but a bloodied mask with hollow sockets where its eyes had been. I jolted awake, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would break through my chest. I threw the sheets off and stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to wash my face, to ground myself in reality. But when I flipped on the light and looked in the mirror, the blood drained from my face. My eyes. My right eye had that same dark, fractured star, only now it was worse. The tendrils had spread, snaking across the iris like cracks in a broken window. And in the center of the pupil, I saw them, tiny dark figures writhing, watching. I blinked and the figures blinked with me. I no longer know if I'm awake or still trapped in that room of mirrors. All I know is that whatever is watching through my eyes, it's getting closer. And every time I look in the mirror, I can feel it. The weight of the collector's gaze, waiting for the moment when it can finally take what it came for. And I know it will. The lights above Mill Creek. I'd always heard stories about strange lights in the sky above Mill Creek, but I never believed them. Living in this quiet town for 35 years, I'd learned to dismiss the gossip as local folklore, nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. That is, until the night I found myself standing beneath those very lights, my heart pounding and my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. My old dog Ranger lay at my feet, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of a distant car or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, the hum stopped. It was so sudden, so complete, that I felt my skin prickle. Even Ranger perked up, his ears standing rigid as he let out a low growl. I sat up in my chair, the cold beer forgotten in my hand as a strange silence settled over the landscape. No wind, no cicadas, nothing. Just an eerie stillness. That's when I saw the lights. At first I thought it was a plane. Living near the mountains, we often had small aircraft fly over, usually tourists or folks heading to the nearby lake. But these lights weren't like any plane I'd ever seen. They were too bright, too steady. 3 of them, in a perfect triangular formation, hovered just above the tree line. They didn't move, didn't waver, just hung there, glowing against the darkening sky. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. Ranger barked once, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed off the trees. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch, walking toward the lights. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to get inside and lock the door, but my legs kept moving, driven by a force I couldn't explain. As I approached the edge of the woods, the lights began to move, slowly, almost deliberately, as if they were aware of my presence. They drifted silently above the trees, casting an otherworldly glow on the branches below. I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to follow them, and before I knew it, I was deep into the forest, the familiar path to Mill Creek lost in the dim light. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier. Every step I took seemed to echo, though the ground was soft with pine needles. Ranger stayed close to my side, his hackles raised, but he didn't make a sound. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the lights descended. They hovered just above the clearing ahead, illuminating the trees and casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to move as a low, humming sound filled the air. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard, deep, vibrating in my chest, more felt than heard. Ranger whimpered and pressed against my leg, trembling. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the glow. It was human, or at least it looked human. A man, tall and thin with pale skin and wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were strange, like something out of an old military uniform, but they were covered in dirt, torn in places. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if walking in a dream. "Help me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And more importantly, what were those lights? The man's eyes darted to the sky, and I followed his gaze. The lights were closer now, hovering just above us, bathing the clearing in an intense white glow. The humming grew louder, almost unbearable, and I felt a pressure in my ears as if the air itself was vibrating. "They're coming back," the man said, his voice filled with fear. "They always come back." Before I could react, the lights flared brighter, and I was hit with a wave of dizziness. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt, and I staggered backward, clutching a tree for support. Ranger barked wildly, but his voice sounded distant, muffled by the overwhelming hum that now surrounded us. The man turned to me, his eyes wide with desperation. "You have to help me. They won't stop. They never stop." And then, without warning, the lights surged forward, enveloping him in their glow. He let out a scream, a raw, agonized sound that cut through the air, and in an instant, he was gone. Just gone. The lights vanished with him, leaving nothing but darkness and silence in their wake. I collapsed to the ground, my head spinning. Ranger whined and licked my face, but I barely registered it. All I could think about was the man's words, his desperate plea for help. What had just happened? Who or what had taken him? I don't remember how I made it back to the house. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my porch again, the cold beer still in my hand. The hum of the cicadas had returned, and the familiar sounds of the night filled the air once more. But something had changed. I had changed. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the lights to return. Ranger wouldn't leave my side, as if he sensed something lurking just beyond the edge of the woods. And then, one night, they did return. I woke to the hum again, louder this time, more insistent. The lights were back, hovering just beyond the trees, casting their eerie glow over the yard. But this time I didn't move. I didn't follow them. I stayed in bed, my heart racing, waiting for the inevitable. The man's words echoed in my mind that they always come back. The Stranger's Carnival. It was the summer I turned 28 when I first saw the carnival. I'd been driving through a small, dusty town in the middle of nowhere, one of those places you'd only pass through on your way to somewhere better. The town itself was barely more than a gas station and a diner, but the carnival set up just outside the main road stood out, garishly colorful against the endless desert backdrop. It wasn't like any carnival I'd seen before. The tents were faded, the rides old and rickety, and the posters plastered along the entrance advertised acts straight out of a bygone era. The strongest man alive, the two-headed girl, the human skeleton. It felt more like a sideshow from the 1950s than anything modern, but something about it tugged at me. I was tired and needed a break from the long drive, so I figured, why not? A quick walk through the carnival could be a distraction before I got back on the road. I parked the car and made my way through the entrance, the dry wind kicking up dust around my feet. The place was strange from the start. Despite the loud carnival music that blared from hidden speakers, the grounds were almost empty. A few families wandered between the booths, but they all seemed disconnected from the festive atmosphere, like they were just going through the motions. The first performer I saw was a man billed as the strongest man in the world. He stood behind a small wooden stage, wearing a faded leopard print leotard. He must have been in his late 60s, his body frail and gaunt. Yet there he was, flexing his bony arms as if he were still in his prime. There was something off about the way his skin seemed to hang too loosely from his frame, like he was barely held together. I moved on quickly, not wanting to linger too long in front of him. Next, I passed by a tent advertising the Mermaid Woman. Curious, I stepped inside, half expecting to see some cheap gimmick, a woman in a fake fishtail floating in a glass tank. Instead, I found a woman lying motionless on a low platform, her body completely submerged in water, her long hair swirling in the current. There were no wires, no breathing apparatus. She didn't move, didn't blink, and I couldn't see her chest rise and fall with breath. A sign next to her said she had been living underwater for 10 years. I stared at her for what felt like forever, trying to figure out the trick, but there was none. The longer I watched, the more I realized that the water wasn't just clear. It had an unnatural stillness to it, like glass that rippled ever so slightly. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I backed out of the tent. The deeper I went into the carnival, the stranger it became. The booths were filled with old-fashioned games, ring toss, dart throws, and guess-your-weight stands. But the prizes were unsettling. Dusty old dolls with cracked faces, stuffed animals with missing eyes, and ancient rusted trinkets that looked like they had been salvaged from a junkyard. I was just about to leave when I saw the banner for the Human Enigma. It hung above a small tent in the far corner of the grounds, half hidden by overgrown weeds. The sign showed a blurry silhouette of a figure, its face obscured. Something about it drew me in, even though I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise the moment I laid eyes on it. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the tent and ducked inside. Inside, the tent was dimly lit by a single bulb that hung from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a glass box, about 7 feet tall, completely opaque from the outside. I could see my own reflection staring back at me in the dark surface of the glass. There was no one else in the tent, no barker to explain the exhibit. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to the box. As I did, the surface of the glass began to shimmer, like it was made of liquid rather than solid material. Slowly, an image began to form, something moving inside the box. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure came into view. It was me. I saw myself standing there, staring into the box, but there was something wrong with my reflection. The me in the box wasn't moving the same way I was. It was delayed, like I was watching a video with a few seconds of lag. My reflection's eyes were wide, unblinking, and its lips curled into a strange, unnatural smile. I backed away from the box, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with that eerie grin. Then, without warning, it pressed its hands against the glass, the smile growing wider, more distorted. The glass rippled under its touch, as if it was trying to push through, trying to get out. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I turned and bolted out of the tent. The strange, distorted image of myself still burned into my mind. As I ran, the carnival seemed to warp around me. The rides creaked louder, the lights flickered, and the air itself seemed to thicken. I could hear whispers, voices calling my name, but I couldn't make out where they were coming from. I ran past the strongest man, now collapsed in a heap, his body deflated like a balloon. I passed the mermaid woman, her eyes open and staring straight at me from beneath the water. And all the while, the whispers grew louder, as if the carnival itself was alive, trying to draw me back in. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away from the carnival, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the tents disappearing into the distance. But they were gone. The road behind me was empty, nothing but desert stretching out as far as the eye could see. The carnival had vanished. I drove for hours after that, not daring to stop until I reached the next town. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something I couldn't see. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face from the glass box, the twisted version of me, grinning, waiting. And sometimes when I pass by a mirror, I swear I see it again, just out of the corner of my eye, watching, waiting for its chance to get out. And that's it for tonight's trip into the unknown. Hope you made it through without checking over your shoulder too many times. If you enjoyed tonight's dose of dread, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Dark Domain for more stories that'll keep you up at night. And don't forget to leave a comment below. Tell me, what's your take? Which story gave you the biggest chills? Or better yet, share your own creepy experience. I might just feature it in an upcoming video. Until next time, keep your lights on, avoid mirrors, and if you ever see a carnival that doesn't feel quite right, maybe don't stop.